It was a slow Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the house felt too still, like it was waiting for something to happen. I had just folded the last piece of laundry and was debating whether to indulge in a second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping my hands on a kitchen towel, I walked toward the door, feeling both curious and slightly annoyed. Ever since my son moved out, the house had settled into a quiet routine. Visitors were rare and surprises even rarer. I opened the door and for a moment I just stood there, stunned. There he was, Evan, my son's childhood best friend. He had that same warm, easygoing smile, and his eyes still held that youthful spark I remembered so well. "Hey, Mrs. Whitman," he greeted me, his grin just as familiar as ever. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. Hope it's not a bad time." Evan. I hadn't seen him in over 10 years. The last time he sat at my kitchen table, he was a lanky teenager with messy hair and a backpack full of video games. Now he was taller, broader, his once slender frame filled out with age and confidence. His voice was deeper, richer, yet still carried that playful tone I remembered from so long ago. "Oh my goodness!" I gasped, swinging the door open wider. Come in, come in. Look at you, you've changed so much." We hugged briefly, warm, polite, and he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the house with a mix of nostalgia and curiosity. Nothing had changed much. The same furniture, the same pictures on the wall. But now the usual background noise, the laughter of boys, the buzz of video games, was missing. The silence sat heavier than before. "I can't believe it's been so long," I said, motioning for him to take a seat. "How have you been? How's your family? What brings you back here?" He smiled as he sat at the edge of the couch. "Work, mostly. I have a business meeting in the city tomorrow, so I figured I'd take a little trip down memory lane before all the chaos starts. I made us some coffee, strong with a touch of cinnamon, just like I used to when the boys were younger." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they had spent hours doing homework, or at least pretending to. He told me about his life in Seattle, his career in architecture, and the places he had traveled. I listened, intrigued, feeling a strange mix of pride and something else, something harder to name. Maybe a bit of longing. Somewhere between the second cup of coffee and a shared laugh about the time he broke my favorite lamp while juggling oranges, I caught myself staring. He wasn't that scrappy kid with skinned knees and a crooked smile anymore. He was a man now, composed, thoughtful, and strikingly different, yet somehow still the same. The sudden noise made me jump. "Still remember that lamp?" he chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "I thought you were going to ban me from the house after that." "I should have," I teased, shaking my head. "But you always had a way of charming your way out of trouble." He looked at me, really looked at me. His eyes lingered a second too long, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Quickly, I broke the gaze and busied myself tidying up the cups. "Are you staying in town tonight?" Actually, I hadn't figured that out yet. Was thinking of booking a hotel after dinner. "Don't be ridiculous," I said almost too quickly. "You can stay here. The guest room's ready, and it's just me rattling around in this big old house anyway." He hesitated, but only for a moment. "If you're sure?" I wouldn't want to impose. "You're not imposing. It'll be nice to have someone around." As I made dinner, he lingered in the kitchen, offering to help. We moved around each other with an ease that surprised me, the kind that only comes from years of knowing someone, from shared memories tucked into every corner of a home. We ate at the dining table, soft jazz playing in the background. Conversation flowed effortlessly. We laughed, reminisced, and then, without even realizing it, drifted into deeper waters, talking about the people we'd lost, the regrets we carried, and the strange ache of growing older, feeling like the best parts of life had quietly slipped past us. "I never told you this," he said, his voice quieter now, eyes down on his plate. "But you were always kind of a role model for me." I looked at him, surprised. "You were warm, strong. You always made this house feel like a real home." Something in my chest tightened. I wasn't sure if it was gratitude, guilt, or a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means more than you know." The night stretched on. Clock crept past 11 and we were still talking, curled up on the couch, wine glasses in hand. The space between us grew smaller and then... a pause. A silence, but not an empty one. Something unspoken, something real. He looked at me, his eyes gentle. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, not sure what was coming next. "Did you ever feel like you missed out on something just for you?" I blinked, caught off guard. "All the time," I whispered. "But life doesn't always ask us what we want, does it?" He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "Maybe sometimes it does." The air felt different, heavy with meaning, thick with the weight of possibility. A boundary had shifted. Not with words or touch, but with a look. A shared truth. An invitation to feel something again. Something unexpected. Something deeply human. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing in ways they hadn't in years. The house was quiet, but the silence didn't feel the same anymore. Felt charged, like the air just before a summer storm. Dorm even was in the guest room just across the hall. The same room where my mother used to stay. The same bed where my son's friends would crash after long gaming nights. But this time it wasn't a boy sleeping there, it was a man. And for reasons I hadn't quite figured out yet, that felt important. I told myself it was nothing. Just an old friend visiting, just catching up. But deep down, I knew something had shifted tonight. A glance, a question, a moment of shared vulnerability. It had opened a door neither of us had expected. The next morning, I moved through my usual routine, making breakfast out of habit. Scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. But everything felt different. I noticed the creak of the floorboards, the way the morning light filtered through the curtains, the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was like I was seeing and hearing everything more clearly. He came down the stairs wearing a simple gray t-shirt and sweatpants, barefoot, his hair still messy from sleep. There was something disarming about it, how natural he looked, comfortable and unguarded. Familiar, yet somehow new. "Morning," he said, his voice still touched by sleep. "Something smells good." "Morning," I replied, turning back to the stove. "Hope you like eggs." "Only if they come with cinnamon coffee on the side," he teased. I chuckled softly. "Well, aren't you lucky?" We ate in easy silence, the soft clink of forks on plates the only sound between us. But it wasn't an awkward silence, it was the kind that settles in when two people feel at ease with each other. After breakfast, we ended up on the back porch. The garden was waking up early this year, tulips and daffodils swayed gently in the spring breeze, and the trees were dressing themselves in green again. He leaned back in a wicker chair, sipping his coffee, his eyes scanning the yard. "You still take care of the garden every year?" he asked. I nodded. "It's therapy, I guess. It's beautiful. Peaceful." We sat there for a long time, not saying much. Just existing. And it felt good. Strange but good to have someone there to share this quiet morning without needing to fill it with words. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I almost got married a few years ago." I turned to him. "Really?" "Yeah." Her name was Marissa. We were together for 3 years. It ended quietly. No big fights, just a realization that we wanted different things. There was a pause. I waited. "I think deep down I knew I wasn't showing up the way I should have," he admitted. Something was missing. Not from her, but from me. I nodded slowly, letting his words settle. Sometimes we don't realize what we're missing until someone reflects it back at us. He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt it again. Not just attraction, but connection. A deep, undeniable recognition. "You've changed," he said quietly. "How so?" "You seem different, calmer, more grounded, but stronger too." Like you've made peace with something. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe I have, I admitted. Or maybe I've just stopped pretending to be someone I'm not. A soft breeze lifted a strand of my hair, and without thinking, he reached out, tucking it behind my ear. His fingers lingered just a moment too long. My heart skipped a beat. I should go for a walk, I blurted, standing a little too fast. Get some air. He stood too. Mind if I join you? We walked side by side through quiet neighborhood streets, the kind where every porch had a wind chime and every yard held its own little story. Our conversation drifted between light and deep, favorite books, old memories, music we'd both forgotten we loved. It was easy, familiar, like a rhythm we'd always known but never danced to before. Eventually, we reached the lake at the edge of town. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the soft blue sky above. We stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. I used to come here with your son, he said finally. We'd skip rocks, talk about what life would be like when we got older. I glanced at him. And now you're here, I said softly. Older. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. And you're here too. Still you. I let out a small laugh, but it came out more breathless than I intended. What does that mean? He hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. Maybe it means I never really saw you until now. His words landed somewhere deep inside me, a warmth unfurling in my chest. You were always the cool mom, he continued. But now you're more than that. You're real. Pull. And maybe I'm finally grown enough to appreciate that. I didn't know what to say. The wind carried the fresh scent of spring and lake water. I stared out at the water, letting the moment breathe. When I finally turned back, he was still watching me. I started, but he cut in gently. I'm not trying to make this complicated. I just needed you to know how I see you now. And I don't expect anything from you. I just felt it. His honesty was disarming. No pressure, no expectation, just openness. And something inside me shifted, like the first bud of a flower opening without even realizing it. I see you too, I whispered. We walked back slowly, shoulders brushing now and then. Neither of us tried to ignore the shift this time. Something had changed, and we both knew it. That night, we sat by the fireplace, the warm glow painting our faces in gold. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us was full of things felt, things understood. When it was time to sleep, we lingered in the hallway, standing between our doors. Good night, he said softly. Good night, Effin. He reached out, just barely touching my hand. The lightest touch, but it stayed with me long after he disappeared into the guest room. I stood there in the quiet hallway, heart full of questions I was no longer afraid to ask. 'Cause for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. The next morning, the house felt heavier. Or maybe it was me. Maybe it was the weight of knowing that something between us had shifted, quietly but undeniably. As I moved through the kitchen, I was acutely aware of the echo of last night's silence. The space between Evan's door and mine had never felt so short and so wide at the same time. I told myself not to overthink it. But I did. He came down dressed for the day, jeans, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked different somehow. Not different exactly, more like someone who finally knew who he was. Sleep okay? I asked, glancing up from the stove. He smiled. Better than I have in a long time. We had breakfast together again, like it was something we'd done 100 times before. The conversation flowed effortlessly. His afternoon meeting, the weather, the garden, but beneath it all, there was something unspoken, something new and quietly humming between us. As he gathered his things to head to the city, a strange ache settled in my chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something, and I wasn't ready for it to end. You'll be back tonight? I asked, trying to sound casual. He paused, looking at me. If the invitation still stands. It does. Then I'd love to. Just like that, the day stretched before me, filled with possibility. I spent the afternoon cleaning, not because the house needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I changed the guest sheets, fluffed the pillows, though I doubted he'd notice, and then wandered outside to the garden. Digging my fingers into the soil, I planted fresh herbs. The earth was warm, grounding. But even surrounded by nature's quiet, I still felt his presence, like he had become part of the house itself. As the sun dipped lower, I washed the dirt from my hands and changed into something softer, something that felt like me. I told myself it wasn't a date. I told myself I was just being polite. But deep down, I knew better. When he arrived, he carried a bottle of dry red wine and a small bouquet of wildflowers, likely picked up on his way over. "For the hostess," he said with a grin. I took them, touched. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." Dinner was simple, roasted chicken, asparagus, and rice, but it felt special. We talked more than we ate, our conversation naturally drifting into deeper waters. The wine ran low and the night grew quieter. Through dinner, he helped me wash the dishes, sleeves rolled up, hands wet, laughing when he accidentally splashed water onto my shirt. I tossed a towel at him. He caught it, his fingers brushing against mine. The laughter softened, giving way to something quieter, something unspoken. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low. I nodded. "Do you ever think about starting over? Not going back, but opening a new chapter?" I swallowed. Question landed somewhere tender. "Sometimes. But starting over feels scary, like I missed the window." He held my gaze. "I don't think the window ever really closes. We just forget it's still there." We stood there, eyes locked, the world around us fading away. And in that moment I knew this wasn't just nostalgia or loneliness. This was something real, something new. He stepped closer. I didn't move away. His hand lifted, hesitant at first, then steady, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The same simple gesture as before, but this time it lingered. "I never meant for this to happen," he admitted softly. "But I can't stop thinking about you." I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle over me. I've been trying not to feel it. But I do. Silence spoke louder than words. He didn't kiss me, not yet. Instead, he stepped back slightly, not out of doubt, but out of respect. "I don't want to rush this," he said. "And I don't want you to ever wonder if it was just a moment." I nodded. "Me neither." We moved to the living room, the fire crackling softly. We sat side by side, close enough to feel each other's warmth, but far enough to keep the space between us intentional. That space, thin and delicate, pulsed like a quiet heartbeat. For a while, he reached out, resting his hand gently on mine. Not as a move, not as a claim, just a connection. We stayed like that for a long time, still and quiet as the firelight flickered around us. Eventually, he stood up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should turn in." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Okay," I murmured. He gave me one last look, one that held all the words we hadn't said, and then disappeared down the hallway. I sat there for a moment, my hands still tingling from his touch, my heart filled with something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't infatuation or fantasy. It was hope. And for the first time in years, letting it in didn't feel like a risk. The next morning, I woke up early before the first rays of sunlight touched the curtains. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful, settled. Sitting at the edge of my bed, I let the events of the past 2 days wash over me like a familiar scent, subtle but impossible to ignore. I could still feel the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand in mine. He hadn't looked at me like someone from his past. He had looked at me like someone who mattered. Barefoot, I padded downstairs, the wooden floor cool against my feet, and started the coffee. I didn't expect him to be awake yet, but when I walked into the kitchen, there he was, already sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. That same soft gray t-shirt, that same quiet smile. "Morning," I said gently. He looked up, his smile deepening. Morning! There was no tension, no awkwardness, just an easy closeness, like we had already stepped into something new, even if we hadn't put words to it yet. I poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the table before sitting down. We drank in silence for a while, letting the warmth settle into our bones. Finally, he set his mug down and met my eyes. I thought a lot about last night. So did I admitted. Leaning forward slightly, he spoke with quiet sincerity. I meant what I said. I'm not here for something temporary. I didn't come back expecting this, but now that it's happening, I don't want to walk away. A part of me wanted to resist, the part that had learned to be alone, that had convinced itself I was past the age of new beginnings. But another part of me, the wiser, softer part, simply nodded. I don't know what this is yet, I said slowly. I'm not ready to put a name to it, but I do know that it feels real and rare, and I don't want to run from that. His fingers found mine again, this time with certainty. No rush, no urgency, just the quiet understanding that something new had begun. We spent the morning outside, walking through the garden. He helped me trim back winter branches, asked about the flowers I had planted. We moved like old friends, rediscovering each other, not as we used to be, but as we were now. That afternoon, as he packed up to return to the city, there was no sadness, only warmth. A quiet promise of more. The door, he hesitated. I'd like to come back. I smiled. You'd better. I've already got plans for the garden, and I'll need someone tall to reach the top shelves. He chuckled, then fell silent for a moment. I'm glad I came. So am I. He leaned in and kissed me, gentle and unhurried. It wasn't about proving anything. It was an offering. And I let myself accept it. When he drove away, I stood by the window, watching the dust rise in the wake of his car. But I wasn't sad. 'Cause I knew this wasn't goodbye. This was the beginning of something new, a chapter one never thought I'd get to write. And as I turned from the window and back toward the kitchen, something bloomed inside me. Not just hope, but the quiet joy of rediscovery. The realization that even now, life could still surprise me. Love could still arrive, not with fireworks or grand gestures, but gently, unexpectedly, like a knock on the door from someone you thought was long gone. And sometimes that's exactly what we need.